Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Good
Okay,
afternoon.
good afternoon. So let's open your paper
Yes,
and I'll send it to you again if we need to make if we make more changes. So yeah, one of my I think one of my functions is to help students polish their wonderful English even more, and it includes teaching about how typically in scholarly writing there's certain practices that we tend to follow,
yes,
like not using first person. So I already pointed this out to you, right? So in my opinion, you don't need to say in my opinion, you can just get rid of that. Just make your truth statement, your truth claim, and then support it with evidence.
yes,
And and that's something I want to make sure here. I see, of course, as you know from my comments, that I noted that there's no evidence from the book cited. You have it down here.
oh,
Yeah, you did some research, and that's great. You can do additional research. I applaud doing additional research. You're learning more, but I guess it's kind of important that you use and cite information also from the book because, well, I want people to have the same common set of basic knowledge, right? Which is in that
yes,
book is the introductory basic knowledge. It's used by thousands and thousands of college students in the United States, from one of the most influential political scientists, that guy Sabato and O'Connor helping him. So, that's why I really want you to use and cite specific information from those three different, at least three chapters from chapters 1 through 7. Now,
yes,
you put your essay was interesting, and I indicated where you could do that. I mean, I told you what page number, each of those that
yes.
info, so it should be. Do you have? Let me ask you. Do you have any questions or about my comments that you want to make sure? I want to make sure that I let you ask you questions before I continue.
Oh, oh, you gave me inadequate marks, so I just wonder that it's just because of the lack of incitation of the text information, or just it's something is not enough to the specific the contents of my first draft. So I just
No,
wondered.
it's the lack of the source, the citation of the information from our
Oh,
our book. I mean, that the sources you cite. Of course, I'm not familiar with this, and they're in Korean language, and I'm sure they're interesting and all. But
yes,
in terms of making sure that we study the basic information, uh, and also that we make sure that we understand how Americans understand themselves. So, like the book is used in American college classrooms. So I think it's useful for students at Catholic University of Korea to learn about how Americans learn about themselves. How do Americans study and understand themselves? And it's great that you've studied some Korean authors, but of course, that's how Koreans understand Americans. How about
yes,
we also understand? I think it's kind of important to understand how Americans understand Americans, because that's how Americans communicate with each other, right? Like
yes,
how they engage in politics with each other is by manipulating. Like, for example, I mean, I don't know if the Korean authors here in these sources, if they tell you, for example, that Americans view the American Constitution, as almost as like a holy document. It's like the Bible. It's considered. It's not just the Constitution. It's almost like it's some kind of source of truth, emotional faith, like almost like I said, like the Bible. I don't know, and I don't know those Korean sources that you cite here if they highlight that, but that's why it's so. The fact that the Constitution from the American textbook is itself a source of symbols. Like when politicians in America compete with each other for support from American voters, or when American lobbyists attempt to lobby and pressure politicians, they're going to use powerful emotional symbols, and so that and those emotional symbols, they're going to be explained or discussed in the book. because the book is written for American readers by Americans. So that's why I think it's kind of important that we study the information in the book.
Yes.
You know, if only because if you're going to become an expert on the United States, you got to become an expert on how Americans understand America, as well as how Koreans understand America. You see?
Yeah, yes, I see.
Okay. Okay. So, you know, it's good for me to explain that, because I wonder why, you know, I explain to students why I say we have to use the site-specific information from the scholarly peer-reviewed sources, and then they go off and find their own scholarly peer-reviewed sources, and that's okay. I mean, we will encourage people to be curious, learn more, but we also want to understand in this class how American culture, and that means the best way to study American culture is analyze how Americans teach other Americans. How does Sabato and O'Connor teach other Americans about America? Right? So, you know, like I said, this book is a very popular, prominent book, textbook that's used throughout the United States. So in college, in introductory college classes on American political institutions. And it makes certain assumptions also about what Americans already basically know, right? Like all Americans know about Abraham Lincoln, all Americans know about George Washington. So when O'Connor and Sabato talk about Abraham Lincoln, what Abraham Lincoln did, they choose to emphasize some of the actions and policies of Abraham Lincoln. They know Americans, when they hear Abraham Lincoln, they think that Abraham Lincoln is like Jesus Christ in a way. Abraham Lincoln abolished habeas corpus or suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Oh my God. Now, habeas corpus is this principle in American law that you can't arrest somebody and put them in jail unless you have evidence that they committed a crime, and that evidence has to be seen by a judge, and a judge, a judicial figure, a judge who's independent from the president. He makes a decision. The judge makes a decision about whether or not that evidence is sufficient to allow for issuing an arrest warrant. An arrest warrant is a warrant to a legal document ordering the police to arrest somebody and put them in jail for a while. And so this is considered to be something Americans are very sensitive about, is the right to a fair trial. That's a critical issue that's been a critical issue throughout not just American history, but English history as well. The right to a fair trial. The king cannot just simply arrest you because he doesn't like you. Right? There's got to be, there has to be a legal process. And so when Americans hear that Abraham Lincoln, this figure who saved America during the Civil War, he suspended habeas corpus. It's a Latin term, right? It means is there a body? I mean, habeas means to have, corpus means body, like the body of a human. So like if there was a murder and I charge somebody with murder, there's got to be evidence that a murder happened. Like where's the dead body? Habeas corpus. So that's why it's like interesting to study that book. Because, you know, I mean, that really should make an impact on Americans, that Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War suspended habeas corpus. He could just arrest somebody, put them in jail because he thought they were a threat or undermining the effort to win the war. That they were potential. If they were, he suspected they were traitors against the North in the war. And that's important to know that, you know, and so there's all sorts of implications there that, you mean wartime is dangerous, because during wartime, it's when the government tries to expand its power, and it can do it because it's claiming that it needs to expand its power and control over people in order to win the war in a time of national crisis. And we have something like that today, right? With the so-called War on Terror by George W. Bush, or during the Cold War against during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Americans, the government would expand its power and threaten American privacy and the right to privacy of American citizens not to be monitored and not to have their secrets discovered by the government. The government claiming that it had the right to do that because it was trying to fight the communists or fight the terrorists. And that's like wartime. So, I mean, I think that's why I would argue it's necessary to study the textbook, because we want to know, how do Americans understand themselves?
Yes.
So, okay. And it's easy to do. I mean, I'm not saying you have to specifically. What I'm saying is that I want also, and also, that's the point. I want students to engage in a dialogue with the scholarly literature, specifically the textbook. So I want students to show how their ideas have a relationship to the information that's in the textbook. It doesn't mean, like, for example, I say you're right, the 10th Amendment also clearly states the limits of the federal government's interference with the state government, which further strengthens the state government's autonomy. All right, so and so that 10th Amendment, why was that 10th Amendment put in there? What is the significance of the 10th Amendment? Why was it put in the Bill of Rights, that first 10 amendments that really were part of the Constitution, that they were adopted at the same time of the Constitution? Why was that put there? And what is it? What does it? More importantly, what does it indicate? And it indicates that Americans, even from the way back at the beginning of the Republic, they have this cultural suspicion of strong central government, and that suspicion comes from different sources. Unfortunately, and Americans don't like to hear this typically, but unfortunately, one of those sources of suspicion is that the federal national government might try to abolish slavery. That was always a suspicion. That's not the only reason, but that's a powerful suspicion. I mean, that's not given enough weight by Americans studying America in terms of explaining American political culture, American political attitudes and values. Because Americans themselves don't know it. They might not be aware of it, but there was always, from the very founding of America, that there was this, first off, America was a place people went to pursue their dreams, including worshiping God in the way they want, but just as importantly, to improve their life by making wealth. And that meant exploiting the resources in North America. And it quickly moved in the direction of making sure that there are people who are forced to work there. And when it was difficult to get Europeans to be forced to work there, there were some efforts to get English people to work there as what were called indentured servants. I don't think we talked about it in class, but like, if you're a poor English peasant in the 18th century and you were on the verge of starvation, you didn't have any money to go to America, right? So how would you get to America? You would basically sell yourself. You would agree to become what's called a serf. Like, you would force yourself to work for that person for no pay for, I think the term was 7 years. And that rich person would pay to take you over on the ship to America, and you'd have to work for that person for, I think typically it was like 7 years. It could be shorter, it could be longer, but it's typically 7 years. And you worked as basically a slave. I mean, you had your rights. You couldn't be treated like a dog, but you had to work for free, and you had to do what the master told you to do, what you were told to do. And that's how. But once you got to North America, and you're a white person, you're a European, it's very easy to just run away. I mean, America's huge, right? I'm not very easy, but it's difficult to enforce that rule. And then then the rich people wanted labor to work for longer than 7 years. So somebody got the bright idea to exploit the slave trade in Africa, because Africa still had a slave trade within it, like in ancient times in Korea and in Europe. You know, they were, it used to be slavery in the Roman Empire, and, you know, slavery in ancient Chosun, you know, Korea. There was still slavery in Africa. So somebody decided to exploit that, and they knew it, that it was available. So it's not like the Americans went there and kidnapped people and stole. I mean, they bought them from other Africans. And, you know, Black people don't like to talk about this, but this is a fact, right? They still have slavery in Africa. It's still there. It's covered on CNN. And and then of course, but pretty quickly, I mean, the British were quite willing to exploit that system, because as industrialization really accelerated in England, and they needed cotton to make cloth and clothes. Cotton only grew at that point. I guess it was discovered in North America. I don't know where cotton was discovered. Like, was it a plant that was first discovered in, I don't know. I never checked. But that's where the British textile factories got their first cotton. And so they were quite willing to exploit American resources, including the use of slavery, to force these people to work on the cotton plantations. But at the same time, the English really were becoming unwilling to tolerate slavery within England. So long before the United States broke away, America broke away from Great Britain, the British had pretty much made slavery illegal inside Britain. And so, as the conflict with America became more and more intense through the middle of the 18th century, there was always a suspicion that the British would punish America or threaten America with freeing the slaves that Americans have if the Americans didn't obey London. And so that was part of the suspicion that many Americans had regarding strong central government. And that's not really talked enough about, because it's unpleasant. Americans don't want to talk about this stuff. And typically, and and then of course there emerged an entire form of civilization in the southern part of America, south of the Ohio River, where tobacco and cotton were the beginning of it. An entire type of civilization, including a institutionalization of worldviews that were self-serving. Like we talk about this in class, right? In my classes, people have a predisposition to understand the world and perceive the world and the world around them in ways that allow them to feel good about themselves, that allows them to feel good about doing and exploiting and living the way they live, if it's beneficial for them. So there emerged an entire civilization and an entire sense of, in the sense of an entire set of a system of norms and values and that was based upon what basically is we call casteism, like in India. And people tend to want to evaluate themselves, are born into that system. They are then socialized into that system from the time they come out of their mother's womb, and that becomes their identity. That a white person is superior to Black people, and that's the starting point of everything. That white men are superior to Blacks and men are superior to women. And since it exists, God must want it that way. At least we'll make ourselves believe that God wants that. Now, I'm not saying everybody views this in this way, but I'm trying to explain the Civil War. Why is it that 3/4 of those white soldiers fighting for the South, they were willing to die to defend that system, when 3/4 of them were too poor? They didn't own any slaves. They didn't own any Black people. But why were they willing to fight for that system? Because it's who they are. It's who they are. They're white, and whites are the master race over Blacks. That's just the way it is. And so that hostility to central government has maybe its most important foundation in that desire to maintain a world based upon caste. And caste means skin color. And I mean, because the northern economic interest, where you don't have cotton, you don't have tobacco, where it can't be grown, because where there was more industrialization, there was more modern developing economics, they very quickly wanted a strong central government because they wanted to industrialize. They wanted infrastructure, they wanted railroad. First they wanted canals, then they wanted railroads, then they wanted protection from British imports, then they wanted a government that could help the economy, the new emerging national economy grow. So this goes back to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, he's on, I don't have Alexander Hamilton, he's on the $10 bill. Do I have a $10 bill? No, I don't have a $10 bill. But Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's chief of staff during the Revolutionary War. And he was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he wanted to build a strong central government because he thought a strong central government was necessary to make a strong national economy, an industrializing economy. You know, with a Bank of the United States, and you know, and he was one of the founders, and he got killed in a duel. But you know, if he hadn't been killed, he probably would have become a president at some point. But so I mean, that goes back to explain, where did this 10th Amendment come from? Because you're trying to get these people to approve the new Constitution. A small segment of the American population that is allowed to vote in 1791 includes a lot of rich Southern people. And they want to be guaranteed, if they're going to approve this Constitution, that the federal government is not going to do something that, unless we allow them to do something we want them to do. Like, for example, abolish slavery. And that was really hard to do. Even during the Civil War, like I talked about in class, the US Congress, and a war is going on, thousands of people are dying, and the US Congress could not pass a law abolishing slavery. It didn't pass the US Congress. When the North dominated the Congress, they couldn't pass it. And the only reason why the process began was because Lincoln used his power as the commander-in-chief, according to the Constitution, to abolish slavery in those areas that were in rebellion against the federal government. So those areas that were not in rebellion but still had slavery could keep their slaves, according to the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect on January 1st, 1863. So like Missouri was not in rebellion, Tennessee was not in rebellion, and those states had slavery. So slavery continued in those two states because they were not in rebellion against the United States. But Lincoln kickstarted that process by using his power as the commander-in-chief, saying, I have to do this because this is what we need to do to defeat the South. We'll weaken their economy by abolishing slavery and encouraging the slaves to rise up and further and run away more and disrupt their economy, and that will weaken them and will crush them. So, I mean, I keep coming back to this, this came up, with Donald Trump, how could it be that after 60 years after the civil rights movement that got laws passed, that we can elect somebody like Donald Trump? Why is it that, I mean, there's something like it's like in American DNA, this racism that doesn't come out. Nobody will come out and say, very few people come out and say in America, I'm a racist. They won't say that. They will talk about, I love freedom. And that means I'm suspicious of central government. And that means I want my right to own weapons. I got to keep my own private weapons. But I think so much of this comes from colonialism and enslavement as part of colonialism, to fight the Indian population and to control the slaves that we brought over, the enslaved people from Africa, we brought over to exploit them. Even though we could tell these Black people, they have brains, they can think, they can learn and read and write, but I've got to somehow, I'm not going to just accept that this whole system is somehow wrong. So, and it's really interesting. And if it's true in America, it must not be true just in America. I think it's an issue throughout North and South America. It's just that the Spanish and the Portuguese, I think they brought over more feudal notions of aristocracy that were more explicitly focused on a Yangban. So because the United States was founded by white people who were rejecting the Yangban, the aristocracy. But the aristocracy was the foundation of the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire in North and South America. They didn't want to abolish the Yangban, they transplanted the Yangban. And so it seems like whenever you look at any kind of person who becomes president of Mexico, for example, they all look like they're Spaniards, like they're straight out of Madrid, even though most of the population doesn't look like them. They have Indian features in them. They're called mestizos, they're mixed. They don't look like the president but the president of Mexico, he always looks like a Hollywood movie star from Spain. He's whiter than me, at least in the 20th century. Why is that? And I think it's this legacy of colonialism and racism. I mean, I'm not the first one to point that out. There's this notion, these modern notions of race, they are tied up with, they're connected closely to the early European imperialisms. When, Europe's expanding and they're trying to make sense of this world where they're exploiting all these resources and pushing out the indigenous people and exploiting enslaved labor from Africa, and they try to explain themselves to why they're doing this and why it's okay. And they started coming with this notion, these modern notions today of race, even though they're not biologically rooted in any kind of, they're all subjective. So we talk about Mongoloid race, Caucasoid race, Negro. Those are. Well, I don't know about that. I should take that back. But this notion of Black people versus white people versus Asian, those are all modern notions, and they're somehow connected with the expansion of European early imperialisms. And then the Japanese copied that. I mean, they copied the French and the British almost like, it's like something out of, I mean, they copied them so closely in terms of when they started to expand their empire. It's like they purposely studied the way the British and the French act and said, we're going to do the same thing because that's what you do. And we're now becoming a modern country. So we're going to treat the Koreans the way the Americans treat the Spaniards and the British treat their peoples. And it was even brutal, like during when the Japanese occupied China during the 30s and 40s, they viewed the Chinese like animals. Like you could literally eat them if you wanted to, and they did. Like you could eat animals. You could slaughter Chinese and sell the meat. Like I mean, I remember reading this in the newspaper 20 years ago, because some old Japanese soldiers who they were dying, and they wanted to confess what happened because they felt so bad about what they did during World War II. Like, they used to sell the meat of Chinese people. Like,
Whoa.
but anyway, but of course, at the same time, it's interesting because, of course, so much of Asian culture in Japan and Korea is influenced by China, the Chinese history. Let's just say Confucian and particularly Confucian influence, right? Including in Japan.
Yes.
But so anyway, do you have any questions?
Oh, yes, I think I don't have much of question.
Oh, but okay, but you know what you need to do now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and make sure that the final paper draft is not over like what, 500 words plus or minus 10%, not including the citations. So you can put all the information you want down here, and that doesn't count toward the word count. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
The final draft is also has a limitation in the
Yeah. Yeah.
500 words.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the final draft too. Okay.
Yes, I understood.
Okay, I'll send you this. I don't think I made any more changes, but just in case. Okay. And I'll send you the link to the YouTube videos where you can watch the recording again if you want to. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Thank you for your advice.
Uh-huh.
Bye.